Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You're standing in a vast museum, walking through halls that stretch endlessly in every direction. Each room contains the complete history of a different species that once lived on Earth. Room after room after room, filled with creatures that dominated their environments for millions of years, then vanished without a trace. You pass the trilobites, who ruled the oceans for 270 million years. The dinosaurs, who commanded the land for 165 million years. Countless species that seemed invincible, that appeared destined to last forever, yet now exist only as fossils and faded memories. Then you reach the final room, the human room, and here's what should stop you in your tracks. Our room is different, not because we've been around the longest. We haven't. Not because we're the strongest or fastest or most perfectly adapted to our environment. We're not. Our room is different because of what almost didn't happen, what almost never was. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's exactly what I created this for. So maybe subscribe and let me know in the comments where you are and what time it is. I love seeing London at lunch, Sydney at sunrise, Chicago at midnight, all listening together. There's something beautiful about that connection across time zones. But tonight's story isn't just about connection. It's about survival against odds so impossible they seem fictional. It's about a moment in our species' history when everything hung by a thread so thin that the fact you're hearing these words right now is nothing short of miraculous. Picture this scenario. You wake up tomorrow morning and discover that 99.9% of all humans have simply vanished overnight. Not dead, not relocated, just gone. The bustling cities are empty. The highways are silent. The entire global population has been reduced to fewer than 8,000 people scattered across the entire planet. That's roughly the population of a small town, spread across every continent on Earth. How long do you think humanity would survive? How long before those scattered thousands succumb to isolation, disease, accidents, natural disasters? How long before the human story simply ends? Most experts would give our species maybe a few hundred years under those conditions, maybe 1,000 if we got incredibly lucky. The genetic bottlenecks alone would probably doom us within 50 generations. It's just not enough people to sustain a viable breeding population long term. Now here's the part that will keep you awake despite my best efforts to help you sleep. That scenario I just described, that nightmare situation where 99.9% of humanity disappears, that actually happened to our ancestors. Not tomorrow, not in some dystopian future, but roughly 1 million years ago. And it wasn't a few hundred years of struggling to survive. It was over 100,000 years, more than 4,000 generations of hanging on by the absolute thinnest margin possible. The population that survived was even smaller than my hypothetical scenario. We're talking about fewer than 1,300 breeding individuals. That's not 1,300 families, that's 1,300 people capable of having children, scattered across the African continent during one of the most brutal climate disasters in Earth's history. To put this in perspective, there are high schools with more students than the entire human breeding population during this period. There are apartment buildings in major cities that house more people than existed in our entire species gene pool for over 100,000 years. Yet somehow, impossibly, those 1,300 people didn't just survive, they became us. Every human being alive today, all 8 billion of us, can trace our genetic lineage back to that impossibly small group of survivors who refused to give up during humanity's darkest hour. This isn't ancient mythology or religious allegory. This is hard science, discovered just recently using cutting-edge genetic analysis techniques that can peer back through nearly 1 million years of human evolution. The evidence is written in our DNA like a molecular time capsule, telling the story of the closest our species has ever come to complete extinction. For decades, scientists knew something had happened in our distant past. Human genetic diversity is weirdly low compared to other species. Take chimpanzees, for example. They live in small, scattered groups across Africa, yet they have far more genetic variation among their populations than all 8 billion humans combined. That's not normal. That's the signature of what biologists call a population bottleneck, an event so severe it nearly wiped out our entire lineage. But nobody knew how severe that bottleneck actually was until a team of researchers in China decided to dig deeper into the genetic data. What they found was so shocking, so statistically improbable, that they spent years double-checking their calculations because they couldn't believe the numbers were real. The mathematical models were screaming that something catastrophic had happened around 900,000 years ago, but the scale was beyond anything previously imagined in human evolutionary history. The data suggested that 98.7% of the human ancestral population had been wiped out in a relatively short period, and the survivors had remained at critically low numbers for over 100,000 years. Think about that timeline for a moment. Modern humans, as we know them today, have only existed for about 300,000 years. The period we're talking about, this extended near-extinction event, lasted longer than our entire existence as a recognizable species. It's like discovering that your family tree has a section where it narrows down to almost nothing, then somehow manages to grow back into the vast branching network of humanity we see today. When populations get as small as 1,300 breeding individuals, they enter what biologists call the extinction vortex. It's a spiral of genetic and demographic problems that usually leads to complete species collapse. Inbreeding becomes inevitable, reducing fertility and increasing genetic disorders. Random disasters that would barely affect larger populations can wipe out significant percentages of the group. Disease outbreaks become catastrophic. Most species that hit numbers this low simply vanish from the fossil record. They become another empty room in that vast museum of extinct life forms. But our ancestors didn't vanish. For over 100,000 years, through ice ages and droughts and the extinction of countless other species, that tiny population of early humans kept the flame of humanity alive when every statistical model says it should have been extinguished. What makes this discovery even more remarkable is the timing. 900,000 years ago places this bottleneck right in the middle of what geologists call the mid-Pleistocene transition, a period when Earth's climate went completely haywire. Before this time, ice ages came and went in relatively predictable cycles. The planet would cool down, ice sheets would grow, then things would warm up again in a rhythm that lasted about 41,000 years. But around the time our ancestors were struggling to survive, everything changed. The Ice Age cycles shifted to much longer, more brutal patterns lasting around 100,000 years each. The glaciers became massive, covering huge portions of the northern continents. Sea levels dropped by hundreds of feet as water became locked up in ice. And in Africa, where our ancestors lived, the climate became incredibly harsh and dry. Imagine trying to survive as the world around you slowly transforms from a livable environment into something resembling Mars. Over the course of generations, the forests where your people once thrived turn into grasslands. The grasslands turn into scrubland. The scrubland turns into desert. Water sources that had sustained your ancestors for millennia simply dry up and disappear. This wasn't a temporary drought that you could wait out. This was the new normal, a climate shift so severe and long-lasting that it eliminated most of the large mammals that early humans depended on for survival. The fossil record from this period shows massive extinctions among African wildlife. Species that had thrived for millions of years simply vanished. And yet, somehow, somewhere in Africa, a small group of our ancestors found a way to adapt. We don't know exactly where they lived or how they managed to survive when so many other populations perished. But the genetic evidence is clear. They made it through the worst environmental crisis in human evolutionary history. What's even more incredible is what was happening to human genetics during this bottleneck period. When populations become very small, evolution works differently than it does under normal circumstances. Beneficial genetic changes can spread through the entire group much faster. Harmful changes can also become fixed in the population more easily. It's a high-stakes genetic lottery where the consequences of each draw affect the entire species. During this period of near extinction, something unprecedented happened to human chromosomes. Two of our ancestral chromosomes fused together, merging into a single larger chromosome. This is why humans have 46 chromosomes, while our closest relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas, have 48. Chromosome fusion is incredibly rare, happening maybe once in millions of years under normal circumstances. But during the bottleneck, with such a small population, this genetic accident could spread through the entire group within just a few generations. Today, every human on Earth carries this fused chromosome. It's called chromosome 2, and scientists can actually pinpoint the exact location where the fusion occurred. They can see the molecular scars where two ancient chromosomes joined together nearly 1 million years ago. Some researchers believe this chromosome fusion may have triggered changes in brain development that contributed to the evolution of larger, more complex human brains. Genes near the fusion site affect neural function, and it's possible that the genetic reshuffling during the bottleneck helped accelerate the development of the cognitive abilities that would eventually make humans so successful. Think about the profound implications of that. Our intelligence, our capacity for language, art, music, and abstract thought, our ability to create technology and reshape our environment, all of it might trace back to a genetic accident that happened when there were barely more than 1,000 humans left alive on the entire planet. The evidence for this ancient bottleneck is embedded in every cell of your body. Population geneticists can read the molecular signatures, like archaeologists examining artifacts from a lost civilization. The patterns of genetic variation, the mathematical fingerprints of near extinction, the chromosomal fusion that marks us as bottleneck survivors. It's all there in your DNA, telling the story of those desperate millennia when survival meant everything and the future of humanity hung in the balance. But for decades, scientists couldn't interpret these genetic signals correctly. Older analysis methods could detect that something significant had happened in our evolutionary past, but they couldn't see the full picture. It was like trying to read a book through a keyhole, catching glimpses of words and phrases, but missing the complete story. It took the development of revolutionary computational tools and the analysis of thousands of modern genomes to finally crack the code. When the research team, led by Dr. Yun-Gui Yang, published their findings in 2023, the scientific community was stunned not just by how severe the bottleneck had been, but by how long it had lasted. Most population bottlenecks in evolutionary history are relatively brief events. A volcanic eruption decimates a species, then the survivors rapidly multiply to fill the empty ecological space. A disease outbreak kills 90% of a population, but the remaining 10% recover within a few generations. But 117,000 years of near extinction? That's not just a bottleneck, that's an extended near-death experience for an entire species, a test of endurance that pushes the very limits of what's biologically possible for a large mammal like humans to survive. So where exactly were these survivors hiding? What kind of environment could sustain such a small population for over 100,000 years while the rest of the continent was being ravaged by climate disaster? These are the questions that keep researchers awake at night, poring over geological data and climate models, trying to piece together one of the greatest survival stories in evolutionary history. The answer likely lies in what scientists call refugia, pockets of stability in an otherwise chaotic world. Picture an oasis, not just of water, but of everything needed for long-term survival. Perhaps it was a highland region that still received enough rainfall to support vegetation when the lowlands had turned to dust. Maybe it was a river valley fed by underground springs that continued flowing even when surface water elsewhere had vanished. Or perhaps it was something more subtle, a microclimate created by unique geographical features that buffered the worst effects of the global climate crisis. Mountain ranges can create rain shadows and temperature gradients. Rift valleys can channel moisture and create their own weather patterns. Large lakes can moderate temperatures and provide reliable water sources even during extended droughts. Whatever the exact location, this refuge would have needed to provide everything a small human population required for survival across millennia. Fresh water, obviously, but also plant foods, animals to hunt, materials for tools and shelter, and enough space for the population to spread out and avoid the genetic problems that come with extreme inbreeding. The archaeological record from this period is frustratingly sparse, which actually makes perfect sense when you think about it. With only about 1,300 breeding individuals scattered across potentially hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, the chances of any of them dying in circumstances that would preserve their remains for nearly 1,000,000 years were astronomically small. It's like looking for evidence of a small town that existed for 100,000 years, except the town was spread across an area the size of several modern countries, and you're trying to find traces of it after nearly 1,000,000 years of erosion, geological activity, and environmental change. The few human fossils we do have from this time period are mostly from Europe and Asia, representing populations that weren't part of the main bottleneck event. But the genetic evidence tells us something fascinating about how these survivors lived. The mathematical models suggest they weren't all huddled together in one location, which would have been evolutionarily disastrous. A single catastrophe could have wiped out the entire species. Instead, they were organized in what biologists call a metapopulation structure, small groups scattered across the landscape, but connected by occasional migration and gene flow. Imagine a network of tiny communities, each containing perhaps 20 to 50 individuals, separated by dozens or even hundreds of miles, but linked by kinship ties and trade relationships. Some groups might have lived near permanent water sources. Others might have specialized in exploiting seasonal resources, following migration patterns of animals or the ripening cycles of wild plants. This distributed survival strategy meant that when disaster struck one group, whether from disease, predation, natural disasters, or resource failure, the others could potentially survive and eventually repopulate the empty territory. It's a high-stakes game of demographic roulette that played out over thousands of generations, with individual communities rising and falling while the overall network somehow persisted. Living in such small, isolated groups would have created incredible selective pressure for cooperation and social cohesion. In a community of 30 people, you can't afford to have antisocial individuals disrupting group harmony. Everyone's survival depends on everyone else. The person who hoards resources when others are starving dooms not just themselves, but potentially the entire local population. This intense selection for pro-social behavior might explain why humans today are so remarkably cooperative compared to other primates. While chimpanzees can barely maintain stable groups larger than 30 or 40 individuals, humans routinely cooperate in groups of hundreds, thousands, even millions. We have an almost supernatural ability to trust strangers, share resources with people we've never met, and coordinate complex activities across vast social networks. That capacity for large-scale cooperation didn't evolve recently. It was forged during those brutal millennia when survival literally depended on the ability of small groups to work together perfectly, day after day, generation after generation, for over 100,000 years. The survivors also would have become masters of environmental knowledge. When your entire population can fit in a large auditorium, you cannot afford to lose information about where to find water during different seasons, which plants are edible, how to predict weather patterns, or how to track and hunt the animals that provided crucial protein. This created enormous evolutionary pressure for intelligence, specifically the kind of practical, survival-oriented intelligence that could acquire, retain, and transmit complex environmental knowledge across generations. Children who learned quickly had better survival odds. Adults who could teach effectively increased their group's chances of making it through the next crisis. Over thousands of generations, this pressure refined human cognitive abilities in ways that would prove crucial later in our evolutionary history. The same mental skills that helped bottleneck survivors remember the locations of seasonal water sources would eventually be used to develop agriculture, create written language, and build civilizations. But it wasn't just individual intelligence that was being selected for. It was also what psychologists call social intelligence, the ability to understand and predict other people's behavior, to know when to cooperate and when to compete, when to share information and when to keep secrets. In groups this small, Reading social dynamics correctly could mean the difference between life and death. Misunderstand someone's intentions, fail to pick up on subtle social cues, or misjudge the group's mood, and you might find yourself ostracized from the only community within hundreds of miles. And ostracism in this context didn't mean social embarrassment, it meant death. This intense social environment would have rapidly weeded out individuals who couldn't navigate complex interpersonal relationships. Over time, it created humans with an almost uncanny ability to read facial expressions, interpret tone of voice, understand body language, and predict what others are thinking and feeling. These social cognitive abilities, refined during the bottleneck, would later become the foundation for everything from storytelling and art to politics and trade networks. But during those harsh millennia, they served a much simpler purpose: keeping small groups of desperate people working together when working together was the only way anyone survived. The survivors also developed what might have been the first systematic teaching traditions in human history. Unlike other animals, which learn primarily through observation and trial and error, humans became obsessed with actively transferring knowledge from adults to children. This makes evolutionary sense when you consider the stakes involved if an experienced adult died without passing on their knowledge of where to find water during drought years, or which roots were safe to eat, or how to make fire in wet conditions. That information loss could doom the entire group. So natural selection favored adults who were compulsive teachers and children who were eager students. Over thousands of generations, this created the teaching and learning behaviors that are so characteristic of humans today. We are the only species that systematically instructs our young in complex skills, spending years of our lives just showing them how to do things they could theoretically figure out on their own. This educational instinct, born from desperation during the bottleneck, would eventually become the foundation of human culture. It's why we have universities and schools, why we write instruction manuals and create tutorials, why we feel compelled to share knowledge, even with strangers. That drive to teach and learn isn't just cultural, it's genetic, encoded in our DNA by nearly 100,000 years of selection pressure during humanity's darkest period. The technological innovations during this period were probably minimal by modern standards. These weren't people with the luxury of experimenting with new inventions. They were focused on perfecting the essential survival technologies their lives depended on: fire making, tool crafting, food processing, and shelter construction. But even basic technologies would have been refined to incredible levels of efficiency and reliability. When your entire species consists of 1,300 people scattered across a harsh landscape, you cannot afford tools that break, fires that won't start, or food processing techniques that fail. Everything had to work perfectly, every time. This demand for technological reliability might explain why humans today are such compulsive tool users and inventors. We see problems everywhere and immediately start thinking about tools to solve them. We're not content to adapt our bodies to the environment the way other animals do. We adapt the environment to suit our bodies through technology. That technological mindset, that instinct to solve problems through invention rather than biological adaptation, was probably essential for bottleneck survival. The groups that developed better tools, more efficient hunting techniques, and more reliable food processing methods had better odds of making it through each crisis. And there were many crises. Over 117,000 years, the survivors would have faced droughts that lasted decades, disease outbreaks that could eliminate entire communities, predator populations that grew when human numbers were too small to pose a threat, and countless other challenges that would test every survival skill they possessed. Each crisis eliminated the groups that were less prepared, less cooperative, or less adaptable. What remained were the descendants of the most resilient, most innovative, most socially cohesive humans who had ever lived. By the time the climate crisis finally began to ease around 813,000 years ago, the survivors weren't just tough, they were evolutionarily refined survival machines. When the rains finally returned to Africa, they didn't come all at once. It started slowly, tentatively, like the world testing whether it was safe to hope again. A few scattered showers in regions that had seen nothing but dust for thousands of years. Seasonal streams that had been dry beds for millennia began to trickle with water. Grass seeds that had lain dormant in the soil for generations suddenly sprouted in patches of green that must have seemed miraculous to the survivors. But the humans who witnessed this transformation weren't the same species that had entered the bottleneck nearly 120,000 years earlier. They had been forged by the most intense evolutionary pressure imaginable, refined like metal, in a furnace until only the strongest, smartest, most adaptable traits remained. When the climate began to improve, they were ready. What happened next was explosive in evolutionary terms. Within just a few thousand years, which is essentially an instant in the timeline of human evolution, the descendants of those 1,300 survivors began spreading across Africa at an unprecedented rate. Their population didn't just grow, it erupted like water, bursting through a dam that had held it back for over 100,000 years. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a sudden appearance of more sophisticated stone tools across multiple sites in Africa. Not the crude choppers and hand axes that had dominated human technology for millions of years, but carefully crafted implements designed for specific tasks. Spear points with perfect symmetry, scrapers with precisely angled edges, cutting tools that show evidence of systematic production techniques. More importantly, those tools show remarkable consistency across vast distances, suggesting that knowledge was spreading rapidly between groups. This is the signature of true cultural evolution, where ideas move faster than genes, allowing rapid adaptation to new opportunities and challenges. The survivors had learned something during those desperate millennia that would change the course of human evolution forever. They had discovered that information could be more valuable than territory, that cooperation could be more powerful than competition, and that teaching could be more important than individual survival. As they expanded across the recovering landscape, they weren't just looking for food and water. They were actively seeking other human groups, establishing trade networks, sharing knowledge, and creating the first truly continental human community. Genetic analysis shows that during this expansion period, there was extensive gene flow between previously isolated populations, as if scattered groups were deliberately reconnecting after generations of separation. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery from this period is what happened to human brain development. Cranial capacity measurements from fossils just after the bottleneck period show a noticeable increase compared to those from before the crisis. The human brain was literally growing larger, and it was growing fast. This wasn't just random evolutionary drift. The selective pressures during the bottleneck had favored individuals with enhanced cognitive abilities, better memory, improved problem-solving skills, and more sophisticated social intelligence. As the population expanded and resources became more available, these mental advantages translated into survival and reproductive success on an unprecedented scale. The larger brains came with costs. They required more energy to maintain, which meant these early humans needed to become even more efficient at finding and processing food. But they also came with enormous benefits. Enhanced pattern recognition that could predict weather changes months in advance, improved spatial memory that could map cognition, that could maintain vast territories in perfect detail, better social relationships across increasingly complex networks of allies and trading partners. Most importantly, these expanded cognitive abilities enabled something entirely new in the history of life on Earth: symbolic thinking, the capacity to represent abstract concepts with sounds, gestures, and eventually marks on cave walls and carved objects. Language, in its fullest sense, was probably born during this post-bottleneck expansion. Not the simple communication systems that other animals use, but true symbolic language capable of discussing things that aren't physically present, events that happened in the past, possibilities that might occur in the future. Archaeological sites from this period begin showing the first clear evidence of symbolic behavior: ochre pigments used for body painting or cave art, carefully carved bone objects that serve no obvious practical purpose but might have had ritual or decorative significance, burial sites that suggest the development of beliefs about death and possibly an afterlife. These aren't just cultural artifacts, they're evidence of a cognitive revolution that was directly enabled by the genetic and behavioral changes that occurred during the bottleneck. The same selective pressures that had refined cooperation and teaching abilities had also enhanced the mental capacities that made symbolic thinking possible. As these enhanced humans spread across Africa, they encountered environments that their ancestors had abandoned during the climate crisis. But they weren't just reoccupying old territories. They were actively transforming them, using their improved cognitive abilities to exploit resources that earlier humans had been unable to access. They developed systematic burning techniques to manage grasslands and encourage the growth of preferred plant species. They created elaborate trap systems for catching animals, some requiring coordination between dozens of individuals across multiple days. They began the first experiments with food storage, learning to preserve meat through drying and smoking, and to process toxic plants to make them edible. These innovations weren't just survival strategies. They were the beginning of what would eventually become agriculture, animal domestication, and civilization. The bottleneck survivors weren't just trying to live in their environment. They were learning to reshape it to better suit their needs. But they were also setting the stage for something even more dramatic. Around 800,000 years ago, genetic analysis suggests that the expanding African population began splitting into 3 distinct groups. This wasn't conflict-driven separation, but rather the natural result of a population that had grown large enough to explore different evolutionary paths. One group remained in Africa, continuing to adapt to the recovering but still variable climate of their ancestral continent. These would eventually become the lineage that led to modern humans, but that transformation was still hundreds of thousands of years in the future. A second group began moving north and west, following the Mediterranean coast toward Europe and Western Asia. They encountered environments that were dramatically different from tropical Africa, colder and more seasonal, with entirely different plant and animal communities. Over time, these populations would adapt to become the Neanderthals, developing the robust builds and cold weather specializations that would make them perfectly suited to Ice Age Europe. The third group headed east, spreading across Asia and eventually reaching as far as Indonesia and New Guinea. These populations faced their own unique challenges, from high-altitude environments in Central Asia to tropical islands in Southeast Asia. They would become the Denisovans, about whom we know less because they left fewer fossils, but whose genetic legacy still appears in modern Asian and Oceanian populations. All three groups carried with them the genetic signature of the bottleneck, the fused chromosome, the enhanced cognitive abilities, and the deep-seated behavioral traits that had been selected for during those crucial millennia of near extinction. But they also began developing their own unique adaptations to their new environments. The African population that stayed behind faced perhaps the greatest challenge. While their European and Asian cousins were adapting to relatively stable environments, Africa continued to experience dramatic climate fluctuations. Wet periods alternated with severe droughts in unpredictable patterns. Forests expanded and contracted, animal populations appeared and disappeared. This ongoing environmental instability meant that the African lineage couldn't specialize too narrowly for any particular set of conditions. Instead, they had to remain evolutionarily flexible, capable of adapting quickly when circumstances changed. This created a kind of meta-adaptation, the ability to adapt rapidly to new challenges rather than becoming perfectly suited to any single environment. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this pressure for flexibility would create the cognitive and behavioral traits that we recognize as uniquely human, enhanced creativity that could find new solutions to novel problems, improved social learning that could rapidly acquire new skills from others, better abstract thinking that could plan for uncertain futures and imagine alternative possibilities. Meanwhile, the populations that had dispersed to other continents were developing their own remarkable capabilities. The groups that would become Neanderthals were perfecting hunting techniques that allowed them to take down massive Ice Age mammals. They developed the first systematic burial practices, suggesting sophisticated beliefs about death and possibly spirituality. The ancestors of Denisovans were becoming master navigators and seafarers, developing technologies that would eventually allow them to reach remote islands that required sophisticated boat building and navigation skills. Some populations adapted to high-altitude environments, developing genetic variants that helped them process oxygen more efficiently in the thin air of mountain ranges. Yet despite these different evolutionary paths, all three human lineages remained genetically close enough to interbreed when their ranges overlapped. The unity created during the bottleneck was strong enough to persist across hundreds of thousands of years of separate development. This tells us something profound about the nature of that ancient crisis. The 117,000 years of near extinction hadn't just tested human survival skills, they had created a genetic and behavioral foundation that would define what it meant to be human, regardless of which continent those humans eventually called home. The technologies developed during this expansion period show increasing sophistication across all three lineages. Stone tool traditions become more complex and specialized. Evidence of long-distance trade appears, with raw materials being transported hundreds of miles from their sources. Signs of systematic hunting strategies suggest improved coordination and communication abilities. But perhaps most remarkably, all three groups show evidence of caring for disabled and elderly individuals, something that's extremely rare in the animal kingdom. Fossil remains include individuals who survived severe injuries or illnesses that would have been fatal without sustained care from their communities. This isn't just evidence of compassion, though that's certainly part of it. It's evidence of societies that had learned during the bottleneck that every individual was precious, that knowledge and experience were too valuable to lose, and that communities were stronger when they supported those who couldn't contribute directly, all their members, rather than aid to immediate survival needs. The archaeological record shows that by 700,000 years ago, all three human lineages were using fire systematically, not just for warmth and cooking, but for landscape management, tool making, and extending their active hours into the night. They were creating more elaborate shelters, some with evidence of planned construction and specialized areas for different activities. Most intriguingly, they were beginning to show signs of artistic behavior. Simple geometric patterns carved into bone and stone, pigments used for purposes that went beyond practical applications, objects that seem to have been created for aesthetic rather than utilitarian reasons. These developments weren't happening in isolation. The three human lineages were still in contact with each other, at least occasionally. Genetic evidence shows periods of interbreeding and gene flow, suggesting that when groups encountered each other, they often chose cooperation over conflict. This pattern of expansion, adaptation, and occasional reconnection created a kind of evolutionary laboratory where different human populations could experiment with different survival strategies while still sharing beneficial innovations through genetic and cultural exchange. The survivors of the Great Bottleneck had become something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. A species capable of conscious evolution, able to adapt not just through genetic changes over thousands of generations, but through cultural innovations that could spread throughout populations within a single lifetime. They had learned to be teachers and students, innovators and traditionalists, competitors and cooperators, all at the same time. They had developed the cognitive flexibility to thrive in almost any environment while maintaining the social cohesion necessary for complex cooperation across large groups. By 600,000 years ago, these three human lineages had established themselves as the dominant large predators on three continents. They had survived the worst climate crisis in mammalian history, adapted to dozens of different environments, and developed technologies and social systems that would have seemed like magic to their pre-bottleneck ancestors. But they were just getting started. The real test of what they had learned during those desperate millennia was still to come, because the world was about to change again, and this time The three human lineages would face not just environmental challenges, but each other. Around 400,000 years ago, something shifted in the evolutionary trajectory of these three human lineages. The climate had stabilized enough that survival was no longer the only concern. For the first time since the bottleneck, human populations had the luxury of resources left over after meeting basic needs. And with that surplus came competition. Not the simple territorial disputes that characterize most animal conflicts, but something far more complex. These were species that had inherited the bottleneck survivors' enhanced cognitive abilities, their sophisticated social structures, their advanced tool-making skills. When such capable groups compete for the same resources, the results reshape entire continents. The European populations, the ancestors of Neanderthals, had become masters of Ice Age survival. Over hundreds of thousands of years, they had adapted to environments so harsh that they would kill modern humans within days. Their bodies had become incredibly robust, with bone density and muscle mass that would make professional athletes seem fragile by comparison. Their brains had grown even larger than those of their African cousins, possibly as an adaptation to the complex cognitive demands of surviving northern winters. But their most impressive adaptation was cultural. Neanderthal societies had developed hunting techniques that allowed small groups to consistently take down woolly mammoths, cave bears, and other massive Ice Age predators. They had mastered the use of fire, not just for warmth and cooking, but for creating sophisticated tools. Heated stone could be shaped with precision impossible to achieve through simple chipping. They had also developed what might have been the first systematic spiritual practices in human history. Neanderthal burial sites show clear evidence of intentional placement of bodies, sometimes with tools or food items that suggest beliefs about an afterlife. Some sites contain arrangements of bear skulls and other objects that appear to have ritual significance. These weren't primitive scavengers barely clinging to existence. These were sophisticated human beings with rich cultural traditions, advanced technologies, and social systems capable of coordinating complex group activities across multiple generations. Meanwhile, in Asia, the Denisovan lineages were achieving their own remarkable innovations. Genetic analysis of modern populations suggests that Denisovans were the first humans to develop systematic high-altitude adaptations. They evolved genetic variants that allowed them to thrive in the thin air of the Himalayan plateau, changes that were so successful they persist in modern Tibetan populations today. Other Denisovan groups became skilled maritime peoples, developing boat building and navigation technologies that allowed them to reach remote islands in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Archaeological evidence suggests they may have been the first humans to practice systematic aquaculture, managing coastal resources in ways that increased their long-term productivity. Perhaps most remarkably, some Denisovan populations appear to have developed early forms of plant domestication, selecting and cultivating wild grains in ways that would eventually lead to agriculture. Modern Asian populations carry genetic variants that help digest starchy foods, adaptations that likely originated with Denisovan ancestors who had learned to process and cultivate wild cereals. Back in Africa, the lineage that would eventually become modern humans was facing perhaps the greatest challenge of all. While their European and Asian cousins were adapting to relatively stable environments, Africa continued to experience dramatic climate fluctuations. The same variability that had nearly driven the species extinct during the bottleneck continued to test African populations long after the crisis had passed. This ongoing environmental pressure prevented African humans from specializing too narrowly for any particular set of conditions. Instead, they developed what evolutionary biologists call behavioral modernity, a suite of cognitive and cultural abilities that emphasized flexibility over specialization. African tool traditions during this period show rapid innovation and frequent changes in design, as if populations were constantly experimenting with new approaches to familiar problems. Stone implements become more sophisticated but also more variable, suggesting that different groups were developing their own technological solutions to local challenges. More importantly, African populations were developing enhanced capacities for abstract thinking and symbolic representation. The earliest clear evidence of art, music, and complex symbolic systems appears in African archaeological sites from this period. Cave paintings, carved bone objects, elaborate beadwork, and other artifacts suggest the development of rich cultural traditions that went far beyond simple survival needs. But they were also developing something that would prove even more crucial in the long run: social systems capable of maintaining cooperation and knowledge sharing across increasingly large and complex communities. While Neanderthal and Denisovan groups seem to remain organized in relatively small bands, African populations were creating networks that could coordinate activities across hundreds or even thousands of individuals. This wasn't just a matter of group size. It was a fundamental difference in social organization that reflected the different evolutionary pressures the three lineages had faced since leaving their bottleneck refuge. European and Asian environments had rewarded specialization and local adaptation. African environments had continued to reward flexibility and large-scale cooperation. By 300,000 years ago, these different evolutionary strategies had created three distinct human species, each perfectly adapted to their own environments, but increasingly different from their cousins on other continents. The Neanderthals had become the ultimate Ice Age specialists, capable of thriving in conditions that would challenge even modern humans with all our technological advantages. The Denisovans had become masters of diverse Asian environments, from high mountain plateaus to tropical islands, developing technologies and genetic adaptations that allowed them to exploit resources other humans couldn't access. And the African populations had become something entirely new: behaviorally modern humans with enhanced cognitive flexibility, sophisticated symbolic abilities, and social systems capable of scaling up to unprecedented levels of cooperation and coordination. For over 200,000 years, these three lineages developed in relative isolation, each becoming more specialized and more successful within their own domains. The genetic unity created during the bottleneck was still strong enough that they remained capable of interbreeding when their ranges overlapped, but their cultural and technological traditions were diverging rapidly. Then, around 60,000 years ago, everything changed. A small group of behaviorally modern humans, descendants of the African lineage, made a decision that would alter the course of human history. They left Africa. This wasn't the first time humans had migrated out of their ancestral continent. Earlier populations had established themselves in Europe and Asia hundreds of thousands of years before, but this migration was different. These weren't just anatomically modern humans. They were behaviorally modern humans, carrying with them all the cognitive and cultural innovations that had been refined during Africa's continued climate instability. They brought with them technologies that their Neanderthal and Denisovan cousins had never seen. Sophisticated projectile weapons that could kill large animals from a distance, bone needles that allowed the creation of fitted clothing for cold weather survival, fish hooks and nets that opened up entirely new food sources. Most importantly, they brought social organization systems that could mobilize much larger groups for coordinated activities. When these behaviorally modern humans encountered their evolutionary cousins, the meetings weren't immediately hostile. The genetic evidence shows multiple episodes of interbreeding between modern humans and both Neanderthals and Denisovans. Today, everyone of non-African descent carries Neanderthal DNA, and many Asian and Oceanian populations have Denisovan ancestry as well. These ancient encounters weren't just about reproduction. They were also about cultural exchange. Modern humans learned cold weather survival techniques from Neanderthals. They acquired high altitude adaptations from Denisovans, but they also shared their own innovations, advanced hunting technologies, more sophisticated tool-making techniques, and most importantly, their enhanced capacities for large-scale social organization. For several thousand years, the three human lineages coexisted across Europe and Asia. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of trade, territorial agreements, and even collaborative hunting efforts. The Middle East became a particularly dynamic region where populations moved back and forth as climate conditions shifted, sometimes competing for resources, but often finding ways to share the landscape. But coexistence couldn't last indefinitely. The behaviorally modern humans had developed during their extended stay in Africa something their cousins lacked: the ability to adapt rapidly to new environments through cultural rather than genetic changes. When conditions shifted, Neanderthals and Denisovans needed generations to develop biological adaptations. Modern humans could develop new technologies and social strategies within a single generation. This flexibility advantage compounded over time. Modern human populations could exploit marginal environments that challenged even robust Neanderthals. They could recover more quickly from setbacks like disease outbreaks or resource failures. Most importantly, they could maintain larger populations in the same territories, which gave them demographic advantages in competition for prime resources. The archaeological record from this period shows increasing evidence of technological innovation among modern human populations, while Neanderthal and Denisovan tool traditions remained relatively static. Modern humans were developing increasingly sophisticated weapons, more efficient hunting strategies, and more effective food processing techniques. They were also developing something their cousins had never achieved: truly long-distance trade networks that could move raw materials and finished goods across hundreds of miles. This allowed modern human groups to access resources from multiple regions, making them less vulnerable to local environmental changes. Perhaps most importantly, they were developing more sophisticated communication systems. While all three human lineages had language capabilities inherited from their bottleneck ancestors, modern humans were pushing verbal communication to new levels of complexity. They could coordinate activities across larger groups, share detailed technical knowledge more effectively, and maintain social relationships across greater distances and longer time periods. These advantages weren't immediately decisive. Neanderthals and Denisovans had their own strengths: superior cold weather adaptations, intimate knowledge of local environments, and social systems that had proven successful for hundreds of thousands of years. But over time, the modern human's flexibility advantages began to tip the balance. Around 40,000 years ago, Neanderthal populations in Europe began to shrink, not through warfare or violent displacement, but through gradual demographic replacement. Modern human groups were simply more successful at surviving and reproducing in the same environments. They could support larger populations, recover more quickly from disasters, and adapt faster when conditions changed. The process wasn't uniform across all regions. In some areas, Neanderthals maintained viable populations for thousands of years after modern humans arrived. The last known Neanderthal sites are in southern Spain and Gibraltar, where isolated groups survived until around 28,000 years ago. But eventually, demographic and technological pressures proved overwhelming. The story in Asia followed similar patterns but played out over longer timescales. The vast size of the Asian continent meant that modern humans and Denisovans could coexist for longer periods without direct competition. Denisovans who had adapted to high-altitude environments continued to thrive in mountain regions that modern humans initially avoided. Maritime specialists maintained control of island chains where their seafaring skills gave them decisive advantages. But here, too, modern human flexibility eventually proved decisive. As modern human populations grew and their technologies improved, they began moving into environments that had previously been Denisovan strongholds. High-altitude regions, remote islands, Arctic environments all gradually came under modern human influence. The last clear evidence of Denisovan populations dates to around 30,000 years ago, though some genetic studies suggest isolated groups might have survived even later in remote parts of Asia. Like the Neanderthals, they weren't eliminated through conquest, but gradually absorbed or outcompeted by more demographically successful modern human populations. By 20,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was the only human species left on Earth. The three-way split that had begun nearly 800,000 years earlier was over. The descendants of the African lineage, the behaviorally modern humans who had inherited not just the genetic legacy of the bottleneck survivors, but also the cultural innovations developed during hundreds of thousands of years of continued environmental challenge, had outlasted their evolutionary cousins. But this wasn't a story of superior humans defeating inferior ones. All three lineages were products of the same bottleneck event. All carried the same enhanced cognitive abilities, the same capacity for cooperation and innovation. The difference was in the specific evolutionary pressures they had faced after leaving their shared refuge. Neanderthals and Denisovans had adapted brilliantly to specific environments, becoming so specialized that they were nearly invincible within their chosen domains. But specialization, while providing enormous advantages under stable conditions, becomes a liability when conditions change rapidly. Modern humans, forced by Africa's continued climate instability to remain evolutionarily flexible, had developed what might be called meta-adaptations. the ability to adapt quickly to new challenges rather than becoming perfectly suited to any single set of circumstances. When the three lineages finally encountered each other during the Great Migration out of Africa, it wasn't strength versus weakness or intelligence versus stupidity. It was specialization versus flexibility, and in a world where conditions were changing rapidly, flexibility won. The victory wasn't complete, however. Modern human populations today still carry genetic contributions from both Neanderthals and Denisovans, evidence that our ancestors didn't just replace their cousins, but absorbed their most beneficial adaptations. The cold weather genes that help modern Europeans survive northern winters came from Neanderthals. The high altitude adaptations that allow Tibetans to thrive at extreme elevations came from Denisovans. In a sense, modern humans didn't eliminate their evolutionary cousins so much as incorporate them, creating a hybrid lineage that combined the flexibility advantages developed in Africa with the specialized adaptations that Neanderthals and Denisovans had developed in their respective environments. By 15,000 years ago, these hybrid modern human populations had spread to every continent except Antarctica. They had developed agriculture independently in multiple regions, established permanent settlements, and created complex societies with sophisticated technologies and social institutions. The population that had once numbered fewer than 1,300 individuals now included millions of people speaking hundreds of languages across dozens of different environments. They had inherited all the survival skills, the enhanced cognitive abilities, and the cooperative behavioral patterns that had been refined during the bottleneck crisis nearly 1,000,000 years earlier. But they had also developed something entirely new, the ability to consciously direct their own evolution through cultural rather than genetic changes. Instead of waiting for natural selection to slowly adapt them to new environments, they could create technologies and social systems that allowed them to reshape environments to suit their needs. This represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between humans and their environment, one that traced directly back to the cognitive and behavioral innovations that had emerged from the crucible of near extinction so long ago. The same problem-solving abilities that had kept tiny populations alive during the climate crisis were now being used to transform entire continents. The age of human environmental dominance had begun, and it was built on foundations laid during humanity's darkest hour when 1,300 individuals had refused to surrender to circumstances that should have meant the end of our species forever. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Even after modern humans had become the sole surviving human species, they carried within their DNA and their behavioral patterns the deep scars and profound strengths of that ancient bottleneck. Every aspect of how we live today can be traced back to adaptations that were literally beaten into our genetic code during those 117,000 years of hanging on by a thread. Consider how we form relationships. Humans have an almost compulsive need to create social bonds, even with complete strangers. We'll strike up conversations with people we'll never see again. We feel genuine distress when we're socially isolated. We go to extraordinary lengths to maintain relationships across vast distances and long periods of time. This isn't just cultural behavior, it's hardwired into our biology. During the bottleneck, individuals who couldn't form and maintain social bonds died, not metaphorically, literally. In groups of 20 or 30 people, Being unable to cooperate meant being cast out, and being cast out meant death within days. For 4,000 generations, natural selection ruthlessly eliminated anyone who couldn't work well with others. The result is that modern humans are almost pathologically social. We're so dependent on social connections that solitary confinement is considered one of the most severe punishments possible. We create imaginary friends as children and parasocial relationships with fictional characters as adults. We'll anthropomorphize anything, talking to our cars, naming our houseplants, treating our pets like family members. This social dependency shaped everything about how we organize ourselves. Unlike other primates that max out at group sizes of maybe 50 individuals, humans routinely cooperate in groups of thousands, millions, even billions. We have an almost supernatural ability to trust people we've never met, to follow leaders we'll never encounter personally, to sacrifice for causes that won't benefit us directly. That capacity for massive social cooperation is why we have cities with millions of inhabitants, corporations with hundreds of thousands of employees, and nations with hundreds of millions of citizens. It's why we can coordinate activities across continents and time zones, why we can maintain complex economies that depend on the cooperation of strangers around the globe. But it all traces back to those tiny groups of bottleneck survivors who learned that cooperation wasn't just beneficial, it was the only way anyone lived to see another day. The teaching obsession that characterizes human behavior also comes directly from bottleneck survival strategies. We are the only species that systematically instructs its young in complex skills that they could theoretically figure out on their own. Other animals learn primarily through observation and trial and error. Humans spend years of their lives actively teaching children things like language, tool use, social norms, and abstract concepts. This educational compulsion exists because during the bottleneck, losing knowledge when someone died could doom entire communities. Groups that were better at transferring information from adults to children had better survival odds. Over thousands of generations, this created humans who are almost compulsively educational. Watch any adult interact with a child, and you'll see it immediately. We can't help ourselves. We explain everything: how things work, why things happen, what words mean, how to do tasks properly. We create elaborate educational systems, write instruction manuals, make tutorial videos, design training programs. We feel genuine satisfaction when we successfully teach someone something new. This teaching instinct is so strong that we'll educate complete strangers for no personal benefit. We answer questions on internet forums, create how-to guides for free, volunteer our time to help others learn skills we've mastered. The drive to share knowledge isn't cultural, it's genetic, encoded by nearly 100,000 years of selection pressure during humanity's most vulnerable period. The bottleneck also explains our relationship with technology and tools. Humans are obsessive tool users and inventors. We see problems everywhere and immediately start thinking about technological solutions. We're not content to adapt our bodies to the environment the way other animals do. We adapt the environment to suit our bodies through invention and engineering. This technological mindset was essential for bottleneck survival. The groups that developed better tools, more efficient hunting techniques, and more reliable food processing methods had better odds of making it through each crisis. Over thousands of generations, This created humans who instinctively approach every challenge by asking, what tool could solve this problem? Today, we live surrounded by technologies that would seem like magic to our bottleneck ancestors. But the fundamental drive that created smartphones and space rockets is the same one that led desperate survivors to perfect fire-making techniques and stone tool crafting. We are a species that solves problems through invention rather than biological adaptation, because that approach kept us alive when biological adaptation alone wasn't fast enough. The bottleneck survivors also developed what might be called meta-learning abilities, the capacity to learn how to learn more effectively. When your entire species consists of 1,300 people scattered across a harsh landscape, you can't afford slow learners. Yes, children who could acquire new skills quickly had better survival odds. Adults who could master new techniques rapidly were more valuable to their groups. Over time, this created humans with an almost supernatural capacity for learning complex skills. We can master languages with thousands of vocabulary words and intricate grammatical rules. We can learn to play musical instruments that require precise coordination between multiple limbs. We can acquire professional expertise in fields that didn't exist when we were born. More remarkably, we can learn abstract concepts that have no direct relationship to physical survival. Mathematics, philosophy, art, music, literature, these are all products of learning abilities that were originally selected for much more basic purposes during the bottleneck period. The same cognitive flexibility that helped survivors figure out which plants were edible during different seasons is what allows modern humans to master calculus, compose symphonies, and write poetry. The bottleneck didn't just select for survival skills, it selected for general purpose intelligence that could be applied to any challenge. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the bottleneck is what we might call the human resilience factor. Humans have an almost irrational refusal to give up when facing impossible odds. We'll keep trying long after any reasonable analysis would suggest that continued effort is pointless. We'll attempt comebacks from situations that should be hopeless. We'll invest enormous resources in projects with tiny chances of success. This persistence isn't just cultural optimism, it's genetic stubbornness inherited from ancestors who survived 117,000 years of conditions that should have killed them. Every human alive today is descended from individuals who looked at a world falling apart around them and decided to keep going anyway. That refusal to surrender shows up everywhere in human behavior. We'll spend decades trying to cure diseases that seem incurable. We'll attempt to explore environments that are actively trying to kill us. We'll pursue goals that seem impossible and dreams that appear unrealistic. The same bloody-minded determination that kept tiny populations alive during the worst climate crisis in mammalian history now drives us to attempt things like landing on the moon, mapping the human genome, and sending robots to other planets. The bottleneck survivors also developed what psychologists call perspective thinking, the ability to imagine and plan for future scenarios that haven't happened yet. This cognitive ability was crucial during the crisis years because survival often depended on preparing for seasonal changes, predicting animal migration patterns, and stockpiling resources before they became scarce. Modern humans are obsessed with planning for the future in ways that other animals simply aren't. We create elaborate retirement savings plans, build infrastructure projects that won't be completed for decades, and make educational investments that won't pay off for years. We worry constantly about potential problems that may never actually occur. This future-oriented thinking is why we have insurance policies, emergency preparedness supplies, and contingency plans for everything from natural disasters to economic downturns. It's why we invest in research that won't produce practical applications for generations. The same cognitive abilities that helped bottleneck survivors prepare for harsh winters now drive us to prepare for challenges that exist only in our imaginations. But the bottleneck legacy isn't all positive. The same evolutionary pressures that created our strengths also created some distinctive human weaknesses. Our genetic diversity is remarkably low compared to other large mammal species. We lost about 65% of our total genetic variation during the bottleneck, and we've never fully recovered it. This genetic bottlenecking makes humans unusually susceptible to certain diseases and genetic disorders. Conditions that would be rare in more genetically diverse populations are relatively common in humans. Our immune systems are weaker than they should be for a species our size. We're more vulnerable to pandemics because we lack the genetic variation that would help some individuals resist new pathogens. The bottleneck also created some psychological vulnerabilities that persist today. Humans have unusually high rates of anxiety disorders compared to other mammals. We worry constantly about threats that may never materialize. We have difficulty accurately assessing risks, often overestimating some dangers while underestimating others. This anxiety tendency probably helped our ancestors survive by making them extremely cautious about potential threats. During the bottleneck, individuals who weren't sufficiently paranoid about dangers were more likely to die from predation, starvation, or environmental hazards. Over thousands of generations, this selected for humans who are almost pathologically worried about everything. Today, this manifests as generalized anxiety about modern life. We worry about job security, relationship problems, health issues, financial stability, social status, and hundreds of other concerns that rarely pose immediate survival threats. The same hypervigilant threat detection systems that kept bottleneck survivors alive now make modern humans anxious about situations that are objectively quite safe. The bottleneck survivors also developed what might be called tribal thinking patterns, strong preferences for in-group cooperation combined with suspicion or hostility toward outgroups. This made evolutionary sense when resources were scarce, and contact with strangers often meant competition for survival necessities. Modern humans still show these tribal tendencies in everything from sports team loyalties to political affiliations to national identities. We form intense emotional attachments to groups we belong to, while viewing members of other groups with suspicion or hostility. This tribal psychology helped small communities survive during the bottleneck, but it creates challenges in modern global societies where cooperation across group boundaries is essential. Yet despite these limitations, the overall legacy of the bottleneck has been overwhelmingly positive for human success. The combination of enhanced intelligence, compulsive cooperation, obsessive teaching, technological creativity, and stubborn persistence created a species capable of surviving and thriving in almost any environment on Earth. By 10,000 years ago, Humans had spread to every continent and begun developing agriculture independently in multiple regions. They were creating permanent settlements, domesticating plants and animals, and establishing complex societies with sophisticated technologies and social institutions. The population that had once numbered fewer than 300 individuals now included millions of people living in environments ranging from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests to high mountain plateaus. They had inherited all the cognitive abilities and behavioral patterns that had been refined during the bottleneck crisis, but they were now using those abilities to transform the world rather than simply survive in it. Agriculture represented a fundamental shift in human environmental relationships. Instead of adapting themselves to existing ecosystems, humans began reshaping ecosystems to better serve their needs. They cleared forests, diverted rivers, bred plants and animals for desired characteristics, and created entirely artificial landscapes designed to support much larger human populations. This agricultural revolution was possible because bottleneck survivors had developed the cognitive flexibility to imagine alternative ways of organizing their relationship with the environment, the social cooperation skills to coordinate large-scale projects across multiple generations, and the persistence to continue working on solutions even when initial attempts failed. The same mental abilities that had helped desperate communities figure out which wild plants could be processed into food were now being used to selectively breed those plants for improved nutrition, easier harvesting, and higher yields. The social organization skills that had kept tiny groups working together during crisis years now enabled coordination of agricultural activities across entire valleys and watersheds. Most importantly, the teaching and learning abilities that had been essential for passing survival knowledge to the next generation now enabled rapid diffusion of agricultural innovations across vast distances. New crop varieties, improved farming techniques, and better food storage methods could spread from one community to another within a single growing season. By 5,000 years ago, agricultural societies were supporting populations large enough to create the first cities, complex governments, and specialized occupations. Humans were developing writing systems to record information across generations, mathematical systems to manage increasingly complex economies, and architectural techniques to build permanent structures that could house thousands of people. The same problem-solving abilities that had kept bottleneck survivors alive during climate disasters were now being applied to challenges like urban planning, trade management, and social organization. The cooperative instincts that had been essential for small group survival were being scaled up to coordinate activities across entire civilizations. But perhaps most remarkably, humans were beginning to use their enhanced cognitive abilities for purposes that went far beyond immediate survival needs. They were creating art, music, literature, and philosophical systems that explored abstract questions about meaning, purpose, and the nature of existence itself. The cave paintings that appeared around 40,000 years ago represented something entirely new in the history of life on Earth. Conscious beings using their intelligence not just to survive, but to create beauty, express emotions, and communicate complex ideas across time and space. This artistic impulse wasn't separate from the survival skills developed during the bottleneck. It was a direct extension of them. The same enhanced pattern recognition abilities that helped survivors read environmental cues were now being used to create visual representations of those patterns. The social intelligence that had been essential for group cohesion was now being channeled into storytelling, music, and other forms of cultural expression. The teaching instincts that had been crucial for passing survival knowledge to children were now being used to transmit cultural traditions, religious beliefs, and artistic techniques across generations. The cooperative behaviors that had kept small groups working together were now enabling collaboration on massive cultural projects like temple construction, epic poem composition, and ceremonial celebrations. By 2,000 years ago, human societies were producing individuals like Archimedes who could discover mathematical principles that wouldn't find practical applications for centuries, like Confucius, who could develop ethical systems sophisticated enough to guide human behavior across millennia, like unnamed artists and craftspeople who created works of such beauty that they still move people to tears thousands of years later. These cultural achievements represented the full flowering of cognitive abilities that had originally been selected for much more basic purposes. The same mental flexibility that had helped bottleneck survivors adapt to changing environmental conditions was now enabling philosophers to imagine alternative ways of organizing human societies. The same social intelligence that had been essential for maintaining cooperation in tiny communities was now enabling political theorists to design governmental systems capable of coordinating activities across millions of people. The same persistence that had kept desperate populations trying to survive when survival seemed impossible was now driving individuals to pursue knowledge and create beauty for its own sake. The bottleneck survivors had become something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth, conscious beings capable of transcending their immediate survival needs to pursue goals that existed only in their imaginations. They could work for rewards they would never personally receive, sacrifice for causes that wouldn't benefit them directly, and create things whose value lay not in their practical utility, but in their capacity to inspire, educate, or simply please other conscious beings. This capacity for transcendent purpose wasn't separate from the survival adaptations developed during the bottleneck. It was their ultimate expression, the full realization of cognitive abilities that had originally evolved to solve much simpler problems. The same pattern recognition skills that had helped survivors identify edible plants were now enabling mathematicians to discover universal principles that governed everything from planetary motion to musical harmony. The social cooperation abilities that had been essential for group survival were now enabling coordination of projects that spanned continents and generations. Most remarkably, the teaching and learning instincts that had been crucial for passing survival knowledge to children were now enabling humans to accumulate knowledge across thousands of generations, building understanding that no individual could have developed alone. By 1,000 years ago, human knowledge had accumulated to the point where individuals could spend entire lifetimes mastering subjects that hadn't existed during the bottleneck period. Scholars could devote themselves to studying mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, theology, and dozens of other specialized fields that required years of intensive education to understand. This knowledge accumulation was possible because bottleneck survivors had developed not just individual intelligence, but collective intelligence, the ability to build understanding across multiple generations and multiple minds working in cooperation. The same cognitive abilities that had helped tiny communities remember which water sources were reliable during different seasons were now enabling entire civilizations to maintain libraries, universities, and research institutions that could preserve and expand human knowledge indefinitely. The cooperative instincts that had kept small groups working together during survival crises were now enabling intellectual collaboration across continents and centuries. Scholars in different regions could build on each other's work, creating understanding that no individual or single community could have achieved alone. The persistence that had kept bottleneck populations trying to survive when survival seemed hopeless was now driving researchers to pursue questions that might not be answered within their lifetimes, to work on problems that might require generations of effort to solve. By 500 years ago, this accumulated knowledge was enabling humans to develop technologies that would have seemed impossible to their bottleneck ancestors. They were building ships capable of crossing oceans, creating mechanical devices that could perform complex calculations, and developing agricultural techniques that could support millions of people in regions that had once been considered uninhabitable. The same problem-solving abilities that had helped desperate survivors figure out how to extract nutrition from marginal food sources were now enabling engineers to design machines that could harness wind, water, and eventually steam power for human purposes. The social organization skills that had been essential for coordinating small group activities during the bottleneck were now enabling management of global trade networks that moved goods and information across continents. Most importantly, the learning and teaching abilities that had been crucial for survival knowledge transfer were now enabling rapid diffusion of technological innovations across entire civilizations. New inventions could spread from one region to another within decades rather than centuries. The stage was set for something that would have been unimaginable to the bottleneck survivors, an explosion of technological capability that would transform not just human societies, but the entire planet. The cognitive and behavioral foundations laid during those desperate millennia of near extinction were about to enable achievements that would make humans the most powerful species in the history of Earth. But that transformation was still in the future. For now, the legacy of the bottleneck was simply this: a species that had learned to survive anything, to cooperate across any distance, to teach and learn with unparalleled effectiveness, and to persist in pursuing goals long after any reasonable analysis would suggest giving up. These abilities, forged during humanity's darkest hour, were about to reshape the world in ways that would make the bottleneck crisis seem like ancient history. But the genetic and behavioral patterns established during those 117,000 years of near extinction would continue to influence every aspect of human behavior, from the most intimate personal relationships to the largest collective endeavors. The survivors had become us, and we carried within our DNA and our deepest instincts the proof that sometimes, when everything goes wrong, a small group of determined individuals can be stubborn enough, smart enough, and cooperative enough to keep hope alive until the world becomes livable again. The transformation that followed would make every previous human achievement seem like a warm-up act, because by 300 years ago, Something unprecedented was happening to human societies across the globe. The knowledge accumulation systems that had been slowly building for millennia suddenly reached a tipping point, and human capability began expanding at rates that defied every historical precedent. The same cognitive abilities that had helped bottleneck survivors adapt to changing environmental conditions were now enabling systematic scientific investigation of natural phenomena. Humans weren't just observing the world around them anymore. They were developing methodologies for testing their observations, creating repeatable experiments, and building theoretical frameworks that could predict future events with startling accuracy. This scientific revolution represented the full expression of pattern recognition abilities that had originally evolved to help tiny communities predict seasonal changes and animal behavior. The mental skills that had once been used to remember which plants were edible during different months were now being applied to understanding the mathematical relationships that governed planetary motion, chemical reactions, and biological processes. But it wasn't just individual brilliance driving these discoveries. The collaborative learning systems that had been essential for bottleneck survival were now enabling unprecedented coordination between researchers across different regions and disciplines. Scientists could build on each other's work, creating understanding that accelerated with each generation. The same social cooperation instincts that had kept small groups working together during survival crises were now enabling intellectual partnerships that spanned continents. Researchers in London could correspond with colleagues in Paris, sharing observations and theories that advanced everyone's understanding. Knowledge was flowing between minds faster than ever before in human history. The teaching and learning compulsions that had been crucial for passing survival information to children were now driving the creation of systematic educational institutions. Universities, academies, and research societies were emerging across Europe, Asia, and eventually the Americas, creating formal structures for preserving and expanding human knowledge. These educational systems weren't just storing information, they were actively generating new understanding. The same persistence that had kept bottleneck populations trying to survive when survival seemed impossible was now driving researchers to pursue questions that had puzzled humans for centuries. Why did objects fall toward the earth? What caused diseases? How did the human body actually function? These weren't just idle curiosities anymore. They were systematic research programs that applied bottleneck-refined cognitive abilities to unlock secrets that had remained hidden throughout human history. The results were staggering. Within just a few centuries, humans went from believing that disease was caused by bad air to understanding germ theory and developing vaccines. They progressed from thinking the Earth was the center of the universe to mapping the motion of planets with mathematical precision. They advanced from crude mechanical devices to steam engines that could power entire factories. Each breakthrough built on previous discoveries, creating an acceleration of capability that would have seemed magical to earlier generations. The same problem-solving abilities that had helped desperate survivors figure out how to make fire in wet conditions were now enabling engineers to harness steam pressure for transportation and manufacturing. The social organization skills that had been essential for coordinating small group survival activities were now enabling management of increasingly complex industrial operations. Humans were learning to coordinate the work of hundreds, then thousands of individuals in manufacturing processes that produce possible. But perhaps most remarkably, they'd goods more efficiently than any previous society had thought. That revealed the true magnitude of their journey were beginning to understand their own history in ways from near extinction to global dominance. Archaeological discoveries were uncovering evidence of ancient human societies, while early anthropological studies were documenting the diversity of human cultures across different continents. Though they didn't yet know about the genetic bottleneck that had shaped their species, researchers were beginning to piece together the story of human expansion across the globe. They could see that humans had originated in Africa and spread to every continent, adapting to environments ranging from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests. What they were discovering was evidence of the same adaptability that had been refined during those crucial millennia of near extinction. Every human society, regardless of its environment or technological level, showed the same fundamental characteristics that had been selected for during the bottleneck period. Universal human behaviors were becoming apparent as researchers studied cultures across different continents. Every society had complex language systems, sophisticated social organization, systematic teaching of children, technological innovation, artistic expression, and cooperative behaviors that extended far beyond immediate family groups. These weren't just cultural similarities. They were expressions of genetic and behavioral patterns that had been established during humanity's most vulnerable period. The bottleneck had created not just individual survival traits, but species-wide characteristics that showed up regardless of what specific environment human populations encountered. By 200 years ago, the scientific and technological capabilities that had been building for centuries were enabling entirely new categories of human achievement. Humans were developing technologies that could harness electricity, create mechanical precision that surpassed human manual capabilities, and establish communication systems that could transmit information across vast distances almost instantaneously. The same pattern recognition abilities that had helped bottleneck survivors read environmental cues were now enabling systematic observation of electromagnetic phenomena. The social cooperation instincts that had kept tiny communities working together were now enabling coordination of research and development projects that involved hundreds of investigators. The teaching and learning compulsions that had been essential for survival knowledge transfer were now driving rapid dissemination of technical innovations. New discoveries could spread from one research center to another within months, accelerating the pace of technological development beyond anything previously experienced in human history. Most importantly, the persistence that had kept desperate populations trying to survive against impossible odds was now driving sustained investigation of problems that had seemed unsolvable. Researchers were willing to spend decades pursuing questions that might not yield practical results within their lifetimes. This combination of enhanced cognitive abilities, compulsive cooperation, obsessive knowledge sharing, and stubborn persistence was creating something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. Humans weren't just adapting to their environment anymore. They were systematically reshaping it on a scale that affected entire continents. The agricultural innovations that had begun thousands of years earlier were being refined through scientific understanding of soil chemistry, plant biology, and selective breeding techniques. Crop yields were increasing dramatically, supporting population growth that would have been impossible with earlier farming methods. The same problem solving abilities that had helped bottleneck survivors extract maximum nutrition from limited food sources were now enabling agricultural researchers to develop crops that were more nutritious, more resistant to disease, and capable of growing in previously unsuitable environments. But humans weren't just improving food production, they were creating entirely artificial environments that could support massive populations in regions that would have been uninhabitable without technological intervention. Cities were growing to sizes that dwarfed anything in previous human history, housing millions of people in concentrated areas. These urban centers were possible because of infrastructure technologies that applied bottleneck refined cooperative abilities to coordinate incredibly complex systems: water supply, waste management, food distribution, transportation networks, all required coordination between thousands of individuals working toward common goals. The social organization skills that had been essential for keeping tiny communities functioning during survival crises were now enabling management of urban systems that supported more people than had existed in entire continents during the bottleneck period. By 150 years ago, technological capabilities were advancing so rapidly that individual human lifespans could witness transformations that would have taken centuries in earlier periods. The steam power that had revolutionized manufacturing was being applied to transportation, creating railway networks that could move people and goods across continents faster than had ever been possible. The same engineering abilities that had been developed from bottleneck era tool-making skills were now enabling construction of mechanical systems of incredible complexity and precision. Factory machinery could produce goods with standardization and efficiency that surpassed anything achievable through individual craftsmanship. But perhaps most remarkably, humans were beginning to understand and harness forces that had been invisible to earlier generations. Electricity was being transformed from a laboratory curiosity into a practical technology that could provide lighting, power machinery, and transmit information across vast distances. The pattern recognition abilities that had originally helped survivors identify subtle environmental changes were now enabling systematic investigation of electromagnetic phenomena. Researchers could detect relationships between electrical and magnetic forces, leading to innovations that would transform human civilization. Communication technologies were emerging that could transmit messages across continents within hours rather than months. The same social cooperation instincts that had been essential for maintaining connections between scattered bottleneck communities were now enabling coordination of activities across entire nations and eventually between different continents. The teaching and learning compulsions that had been crucial for passing survival knowledge to children were now driving establishment of educational systems that could train individuals in highly specialized technical skills. Engineering, medicine, scientific research, and dozens of other professions were becoming so complex that they required years of intensive study to master. This educational specialization was possible because human societies had developed sufficient cooperative capacity to support individuals whose work didn't contribute directly to immediate survival needs. The same social organization abilities that had kept tiny communities functioning during desperate times were now enabling complex economies where people could dedicate their entire lives to advancing knowledge in highly specific areas. By 100 years ago, the acceleration of human capability was becoming visible within individual lifetimes. People born in rural, agricultural societies could live to see the development of powered flight, automobile transportation, electric lighting, and communication technologies that connected different continents. The problem-solving abilities that had been refined during the bottleneck were now enabling engineering achievements that seemed to defy natural limitations. Humans were building machines that could fly, despite being far heavier than air. They were creating vehicles that could travel faster than any land animal. They were constructing buildings taller than any natural formation in many regions. Each technological breakthrough built on previous innovations, creating compound acceleration that was transforming human societies at unprecedented rates. The same persistence that had kept bottleneck populations trying to survive when survival seemed hopeless was now driving sustained research programs that tackled increasingly ambitious engineering challenges. But humans weren't just creating individual technologies. They were developing systematic approaches to innovation that could generate new capabilities continuously. Research and development processes were being established that could produce breakthrough technologies on regular schedules rather than waiting for occasional individual genius. This systematization of innovation represented the full expression of collaborative learning abilities that had been essential for bottleneck survival. The same cooperative instincts that had enabled tiny communities to share survival knowledge were now enabling coordination of research programs that involved thousands of investigators working toward common goals. The teaching and learning compulsions that had been crucial for passing information between generations were now driving rapid dissemination of technical knowledge across entire industries. New innovations could spread from one research center to another within weeks, accelerating the pace of technological development beyond anything previously experienced. By 75 years ago, human technological capabilities were enabling achievements that would have seemed like magic to earlier generations. Humans were developing electronic systems that could perform calculations faster and more accurately than human minds. They were creating materials that were stronger and lighter than anything found in nature. The same cognitive abilities that had helped bottleneck survivors adapt to changing environmental conditions were now enabling systematic manipulation of matter at molecular levels. Chemical industries were producing synthetic materials with properties that could be precisely controlled for specific applications. But perhaps most remarkably, humans were beginning to understand their own biological nature in ways that revealed the mechanisms behind their exceptional capabilities. Medical research was uncovering the physiological basis for human intelligence, cooperation, and learning abilities. Though they still didn't know about the specific genetic bottleneck that had shaped their species, researchers were beginning to understand that human cognitive and behavioral characteristics had been shaped by evolutionary pressures that favored cooperation, intelligence, and adaptability. The same analytical abilities that had helped desperate survivors figure out which strategies worked best for group survival were now being applied to understanding human psychology, social organization, and biological functioning. humans were becoming conscious of their own evolutionary history in ways that would have profound implications for their future development. By 50 years ago, technological capabilities were advancing so rapidly that the pace of change itself was becoming a defining characteristic of human civilization. Innovations that had taken decades to develop and implement were now being surpassed by even more advanced technologies within just a few years. The pattern recognition abilities that had been refined during the bottleneck were now enabling detection of incredibly subtle phenomena, from subatomic particles to distant galaxies. Scientific instruments were extending human sensory capabilities far beyond their natural limitations, revealing aspects of reality that had been completely invisible to earlier generations. Communication technologies were enabling instantaneous coordination between researchers across different continents. The same social cooperation instincts that had kept scattered bottleneck communities connected were now enabling real-time collaboration between scientists, engineers, and other specialists regardless of their physical location. The teaching and learning compulsions that had been essential for survival knowledge transfer were now enabling rapid training of specialists in highly technical fields. Educational systems could prepare individuals for careers in technologies that hadn't existed when their education began. This educational flexibility represented the full expression of adaptability that had been crucial for bottleneck survival. The same mental agility that had helped tiny communities adjust to changing environmental conditions was now enabling entire societies to adapt to technological transformations that occurred within single generations. By 25 years ago, human capabilities were reaching levels that fundamentally altered the relationship between individual humans and the collective knowledge of the species. Electronic systems were being developed that could store and access more information than any individual human could process in a lifetime. The same problem-solving abilities that had helped desperate survivors extract maximum value from limited resources were now enabling development of information technologies that could amplify human cognitive capabilities. Computers weren't just performing calculations, they were extending human mental abilities in ways that enabled entirely new categories of achievement. But humans weren't just creating tools that enhanced their individual capabilities. They were developing systems that could coordinate the collective intelligence of millions of people working on common problems. The cooperative instincts that had been essential for small group survival were now enabling collaboration on scales that had never been possible in human history. Research projects were emerging that involved thousands of investigators across dozens of countries, all contributing to understanding that no individual or single institution could have developed alone. The teaching and learning abilities that had been crucial for passing knowledge between generations were now enabling real-time knowledge sharing across the entire species. Today, just a few years into the 21st century, we can see the full flowering of capabilities that were first refined during those desperate millennia when our species hung by a thread. Every aspect of modern civilization, from the smartphones in our pockets to the satellites orbiting overhead, represents the ultimate expression of cognitive and behavioral traits that were selected for during humanity's darkest hour. The same pattern recognition abilities that helped bottleneck survivors read environmental cues are now enabling artificial intelligence systems that can detect patterns in data sets too large for human minds to comprehend. The social cooperation instincts that kept tiny communities working together are now enabling global coordination of activities that involve billions of people. The teaching and learning compulsions that were essential for survival knowledge transfer are now driving educational and communication systems that can make the accumulated knowledge of human civilization available to anyone with internet access. The persistence that kept desperate populations trying to survive when survival seemed impossible is now driving research programs aimed at challenges like curing cancer, reversing aging, and eventually expanding human presence beyond Earth. But perhaps most remarkably, we're finally beginning to understand our own history in ways that reveal the true magnitude of our journey from near extinction to global dominance. The genetic analysis techniques that uncovered the ancient bottleneck have shown us that every human alive today carries DNA from those 1,300 survivors who refused to give up when giving up seemed like the only rational choice. We are all descendants of individuals who looked at a world falling apart around them and decided to keep trying anyway. Every technological achievement, every scientific discovery, every work of art or literature or music that moves us, every act of cooperation or kindness or love between humans, all of it traces back to that tiny population that somehow maintained hope during humanity's longest night. The bottleneck survivors have become us, and we carry within our genes and our deepest behavioral patterns the proof that sometimes, when everything goes wrong and the odds seem impossible, a small group of determined people can be stubborn enough, smart enough, and cooperative enough to not just survive, but to eventually transform the world in ways that would seem like miracles to their ancestors. We are living proof that the human story doesn't end when conditions become desperate. It transforms, adapts, and emerges stronger than before. The same species that once numbered fewer than 1,300 individuals now includes over 8 billion people who have reshaped every continent, who have touched the moon and sent robots to other planets, who have decoded the human genome and are learning to cure diseases that seemed incurable just decades ago. And we're just getting started. The cognitive abilities, cooperative instincts, teaching compulsions, and stubborn persistence that carried our ancestors through 117,000 years of near extinction are now being applied to challenges that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. We're working on technologies that could extend human lifespans indefinitely, create artificial intelligence that surpasses human capabilities, and eventually make our species capable of surviving and thriving on other worlds. The journey from that tiny refuge in Africa to our current global civilization represents the most remarkable survival and recovery story in the history of life on Earth. But it's not just a story about the past. It's a promise about the future, written in our DNA and expressed in every human achievement, that we are a species that doesn't give up when faced with impossible odds. We are the descendants of the 1,300, and their legacy lives on in every breath we take, every problem we solve, every connection we make with other humans, and every dream we dare to pursue despite the odds against us. The bottleneck is over, the expansion continues, and the story of those ancient survivors is still being written in everything we do, everything we build, and everything we become. The expansion that followed the bottleneck represents just the beginning of what those enhanced human capabilities could achieve. By the time agricultural civilizations were emerging across different continents, humans had developed something that no other species in Earth's history had ever possessed: the ability to consciously accelerate their own development through cultural transmission rather than waiting for genetic evolution. This wasn't just about creating better tools or building larger settlements. The cognitive abilities that had been refined during those desperate millennia were now enabling humans to think about thinking itself, to develop systematic methods for acquiring new knowledge and solving increasingly complex problems. They were becoming conscious of their own learning processes in ways that allowed them to improve those processes deliberately. The same metacognitive abilities that had helped bottleneck survivors figure out better ways to remember seasonal patterns and resource locations were now being applied to understanding how human minds actually worked. Early philosophers and teachers weren't just passing on existing knowledge, they were developing better methods for thinking, learning, and problem solving that could be taught to others. This created something unprecedented in natural history: a species that could evolve culturally at rates thousands of times faster than genetic evolution. Where biological adaptations might take thousands of generations to spread through a population, beneficial ideas could spread across entire civilizations within a single generation. The teaching compulsions that had been essential for bottleneck survival were now driving the creation of increasingly sophisticated educational systems. But these weren't just about preserving existing knowledge anymore. They were actively designed to help each new generation surpass the achievements of their predecessors. Young people weren't just learning the skills their parents had mastered. They were being systematically trained to push beyond existing limitations and discover things that had never been known before. The same learning flexibility that had helped desperate communities adapt to changing survival conditions was now enabling each generation to build on previous achievements rather than simply repeating them. By the time humans were developing written language systems, this acceleration was becoming visible within individual lifetimes. Scholars could see human knowledge expanding faster than any single person could absorb. Libraries were being created not just to store information, but to organize it in ways that made it accessible to future researchers who would build on existing understanding. The cooperative instincts that had kept tiny communities functioning during crisis years were now enabling intellectual collaboration across vast networks of scholars, craftspeople, and innovators. Knowledge wasn't just accumulating, it was being actively refined and improved through collective effort that involved hundreds or thousands of minds working on related problems. This collaborative approach to knowledge development represented something entirely new in the history of life on Earth. Other species might learn from each other through observation and imitation, but humans were developing systematic methods for pooling their cognitive resources to solve problems that no individual could tackle alone. The pattern recognition abilities that had been crucial for environmental survival were now being applied to detecting abstract relationships between different areas of knowledge. Mathematicians were discovering that the same principles that governed geometric relationships could be applied to astronomical observations. Physicians were finding connections between anatomical studies and surgical techniques. Cross-pollination between different fields of study was accelerating the pace of discovery in ways that multiplied human capabilities exponentially rather than just additively. The same mental flexibility that had helped bottleneck survivors adapt to changing conditions was now enabling scholars to make conceptual leaps that connected previously unrelated areas of understanding. But the most profound transformation was happening in how humans thought about their own potential. The persistence that had kept desperate populations trying to survive when survival seemed hopeless was now driving systematic investigation of questions that had puzzled human minds for generations. People were beginning to believe that mysteries could be solved, that limitations could be overcome, that understanding could be achieved through sustained effort and systematic inquiry. This optimism about human capability wasn't just philosophical speculation, it was based on observable evidence that human knowledge and ability were expanding at unprecedented rates. Each generation was witnessing achievements that would have seemed impossible to their ancestors, creating a cultural momentum that encouraged even more ambitious goals. The problem-solving compulsions that had been essential for bottleneck survival were now being applied to challenges that went far beyond immediate practical needs. Humans were pursuing knowledge for its own sake, creating art for aesthetic pleasure, and developing philosophical systems that explored abstract questions about meaning and purpose. These pursuits might have seemed like luxuries to earlier generations focused entirely on survival, but they represented the full flowering of cognitive abilities that had been selected for during the crisis years. The same enhanced intelligence that had helped tiny communities figure out survival strategies was now enabling exploration of mathematics, astronomy, ethics, and other fields that expanded human understanding of themselves and their universe. By the time technological development began accelerating rapidly, humans had created cultural systems that could generate new capabilities faster than any biological process could have produced them. The teaching and learning abilities that had been crucial for passing survival information to children were now enabling rapid transmission of technical innovations across entire civilizations. New discoveries weren't just being made, they were being systematically improved upon by subsequent researchers who could build on previous work rather than starting from scratch. The cooperative instincts that had been essential for small group survival were now enabling coordination of research and development efforts that involved specialists from multiple fields working toward common goals. This collaborative approach to innovation was creating compound acceleration in human capabilities. Each breakthrough enabled others, creating cascading effects that transformed entire industries within decades rather than centuries. The same adaptability that had helped bottleneck survivors adjust to changing environmental conditions was now enabling entire societies to adapt to technological transformations that occurred within single generations. The results were staggering by any historical standard. Within just a few centuries, humans progressed from basic agriculture and simple tools to complex mechanical systems, global transportation networks, and communication technologies that could transmit information across continents almost instantaneously. But this technological acceleration was just the beginning. The cognitive abilities that had been refined during those crucial millennia of near extinction were now enabling humans to understand and manipulate the fundamental forces that governed natural phenomena. They weren't just adapting to their environment anymore, they were learning to reshape reality itself at molecular and eventually atomic levels. The same pattern recognition skills that had helped desperate survivors identify subtle environmental changes were now enabling detection of relationships between different forms of energy, matter, and information. Scientists were discovering that apparently separate phenomena were actually different expressions of underlying principles that could be understood mathematically and manipulated technologically. This understanding was enabling engineering achievements that would have seemed like magic to earlier generations. Humans were creating materials stronger than anything found in nature, harnessing energy sources more powerful than anything previously available, and developing information processing systems that could perform calculations faster and more accurately than human minds. But perhaps most remarkably, they were beginning to understand the biological basis for their own exceptional capabilities. Medical research was uncovering the physiological mechanisms that enabled human intelligence, cooperation, and learning. Though they still didn't know about the specific genetic bottleneck that had shaped their species, researchers were beginning to understand that human characteristics had been molded by evolutionary pressures that favored adaptability and social cooperation. The same analytical abilities that had helped bottleneck survivors figure out which strategies worked best for group survival were now being applied to understanding human psychology, neurology, and genetics. Humans were becoming conscious of their own biological nature in ways that would eventually enable them to enhance their capabilities deliberately, rather than waiting for natural selection to produce improvements over thousands of generations. By the 20th century, the acceleration of human capability was becoming so rapid that the pace of change itself was transforming human societies. Innovations that had taken generations to develop and implement were now being surpassed by even more advanced technologies within just a few years. The learning abilities that had been essential for survival knowledge transfer during the bottleneck were now enabling individuals to master highly technical skills that hadn't existed when their education began. Educational systems were becoming flexible enough to prepare people for careers in fields that were being invented faster than traditional training programs could adapt. Communication technologies were enabling real-time coordination between specialists regardless of their physical location. The same social cooperation instincts that had kept scattered bottleneck communities connected were now enabling collaborative research projects that involved thousands of investigators across different continents working on common problems. The teaching compulsions that had been crucial for passing information between generations were now driving development of educational technologies that could make advanced knowledge accessible to anyone with the motivation to learn. Information that had once been available only to specialized scholars could now be transmitted to millions of people simultaneously. This democratization of knowledge access was creating something unprecedented in human history: the possibility that breakthrough insights could come from anywhere in the global human population rather than just from established research institutions. The same cognitive abilities that had been refined during the bottleneck were now distributed across billions of minds that could potentially contribute to solving humanity's greatest challenges. The persistence that had kept desperate populations trying to survive against impossible odds was now driving research programs aimed at challenges that would have seemed absurdly ambitious to earlier generations. Humans were working systematically on problems like eliminating diseases that had plagued the species for millennia, extending healthy lifespans far beyond natural limits, and eventually establishing permanent human settlements beyond Earth. These weren't just fantasy goals anymore. They were systematic research programs that applied bottleneck refined cognitive and cooperative abilities to engineering challenges that could be broken down into manageable components and solved through sustained collaborative effort. The same problem solving approaches that had helped tiny communities figure out survival strategies during environmental crises were now being scaled up to coordinate the work of millions of specialists across dozens of fields, all contributing to understanding that no individual or single institution could have developed alone. By the 21st century, human capabilities had reached levels that fundamentally altered what it meant to be human. Technologies were emerging that could amplify individual cognitive abilities, enable instant access to the collective knowledge of the species, and facilitate coordination between billions of people working on common goals. But more importantly, humans were finally beginning to understand their own evolutionary history in ways that revealed the true source of their exceptional abilities. Genetic analysis techniques were uncovering evidence that every person alive carried DNA from a tiny population of survivors who had endured the most severe environmental crisis in mammalian history. The discovery of the ancient bottleneck explained not just where human capabilities had come from, but why they were so remarkably suited for the challenges that modern civilization was creating. The same cognitive abilities that had been selected for during those desperate millennia were now enabling humans to tackle problems of unprecedented complexity and scale. Pattern recognition skills that had helped desperate communities predict seasonal changes were now enabling artificial intelligence systems that could detect relationships in datasets too large for human minds to process. Social cooperation instincts that had kept tiny groups working together were now enabling global coordination of activities that involved billions of people. Teaching and learning compulsions that had been essential for survival knowledge transfer were now driving educational and communication systems that could make the accumulated wisdom of human civilization available to anyone with internet access. The persistence that had kept bottleneck populations trying to survive when survival seemed hopeless was now driving research programs that tackled challenges like reversing aging, eliminating poverty, and eventually making humanity a multi-planetary species. Most remarkably, humans were beginning to understand that they carried within their genes and their deepest behavioral patterns the legacy of ancestors who had refused to surrender when surrender seemed like the only rational choice. Every technological breakthrough, every scientific discovery, every work of art that moved people to tears, every act of cooperation between strangers, all of it could be traced back to that tiny population that had somehow maintained hope during humanity's darkest period. The bottleneck survivors had become modern humanity, and their story was still being written in every human achievement, every problem that got solved through collaboration, every child who learned something new, and every person who refused to give up when facing seemingly impossible challenges. We are living proof that the human story doesn't end when conditions become desperate. Instead, it transforms, adapts, and emerges stronger than before. The species that once numbered fewer than 1,300 individuals has become a global civilization of over 8 billion people who have reshaped every continent, touched the moon, sent robots to other planets, decoded their own genetic instructions, and learned to cure diseases that seemed incurable just decades ago. And this is still just the beginning. The cognitive abilities, cooperative instincts, teaching compulsions, and stubborn persistence that carried our ancestors through 117,000 years of near extinction are now being applied to challenges that previous generations couldn't have imagined. We're developing technologies that could extend human lifespans indefinitely, creating artificial intelligence that might surpass human cognitive abilities, and working toward making our species capable of thriving on other worlds. The journey from that tiny refuge in Africa to our current global civilization represents the most remarkable survival and transformation story in the history of life on Earth. But it's not just ancient history. It's a living promise, written in our DNA and expressed in every human achievement, that we are a species that doesn't surrender when faced with impossible odds. We are the descendants of the 1,300, and their legacy lives on in every problem we solve, every connection we make with other humans, every dream we pursue despite the odds, and every moment when we choose to keep trying when trying seems pointless. The bottleneck is over, the expansion continues, and the story of those ancient survivors is still being written in everything we do, everything we build, and everything we dare to become. So here we are, 8 billion strong, scattered across every continent, reaching toward the stars themselves. Every breath you take carries oxygen processed by lungs that developed from those desperate survivors. Every thought you think uses neural pathways refined during humanity's longest night. Every connection you make with another human being expresses cooperation instincts forged when cooperation meant the difference between species survival and extinction. You are the living legacy of 1,300 people who looked at a dying world and refused to accept that their story was ending. Sleep well, knowing you carry within you the genes of the ultimate survivors.